So the last one we want to talk about today is something called a monopoly. This is what happens when we get down to classifying industries where they just have one firm. And I think you guys know that. You've played the game Monopoly before, and you know that the goal is to be the only one left and to own absolutely everything. That's what a monopoly is. So a monopoly is what we see whenever we see there's one firm with complete control in the market, meaning that there's no close substitute to that product, and also there's high barriers to entry. It's really tough for anyone else to get into that market. Just like everyone else, monopolies do maximize their profit where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. But what we see is that monopolies have complete control over the market, and because they do, consumers have no other option. They have to purchase from that single firm. So oftentimes there can be barriers to entry that are either natural barriers, they might be ownership barriers, they might be legal barriers. But there are some monopolies that do exist. We know historically the United States has worked to prevent monopolies, but there are some types of monopolies that do exist and they're able to exist. And we call those natural, geographic, technological, and government monopolies. We'll talk more about what those are in a second. But the government works pretty hard to prevent monopolies because we know monopolies can take advantage of consumers. And if they're taking advantage of consumers, they're taking advantage of the market. Now, the closest examples that we see to monopolies today are like utilities, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, but like your electric company. And it's because it makes more sense for there only be one electric company. And let's kind of talk about why. An electric company is something we refer to as like a natural monopoly. So if we think about it, why is it that we would allow only one electric company to exist within Carmel? Why don't we have two or three or five? Well, what we see is that a natural monopoly exists because that single firm can produce that good or service at a smaller cost than multiple firms could. They've achieved economies of scale. Think about an electric company, right? Like one electric company has to spread out a power grid across the entire city. So they're really able to spread out their costs across all of their customers. Now, if there were two electric companies, they would be serving half as many customers. Like they would split up the customers. And because of that, they're spreading out their costs, which are just as high, across fewer customers. So it's going to be more expensive for everybody. And so a natural monopoly exists because a single firm can supply that at a smaller cost than multiple firms would be able to. Sometimes we see geographic monopolies. I remember when I was in college, on my way to and from college, I would have to drive through this really tiny town. And it was a really tiny town that was about an hour from my university, but it was literally in the middle of nowhere. And so it was my last stop if I needed gas or if I wanted a drink or anything like that. Well, that little gas station had a geographic monopoly because it was the only gas station in that entire area. They could have done whatever they wanted to with their gas prices, and I would have to pay it because I wasn't getting gas for another, 30 miles in any direction. And so we see like a small gas station in the middle of nowhere or a small town's grocery store have a geographic monopoly. But it's because maybe that town or that area couldn't sustain having more than one of those. A technological monopoly exists because a company has some sort of protected technology for a good or a service. We see that the US government provides patents and copyrights for specific products, whether it's a patent for some sort of technology you develop. Maybe it's for, I know in the drug industry that once you do all the research and development to produce a certain kind of drug, that is then protected for a certain number of years. And so that then has protection on it. You're the only one with that technology, with those ingredients, whatever it might be. And because of that, you have a monopoly. You have sole possession of that technology or product for a given number of time because you've been granted that through some sort of government protection. But then we finally have government monopolies. This could be like the post office is considered a government monopoly because the government, by law, has given that business to one of its own agencies. A lot of times local governments have control over like the water system, right? That's a government monopoly because some government agency has complete control over that market. Now, like we said, the government has worked to prevent monopolies. We've seen, if you remember from your U.S. history classes, like the Sherman Antitrust Act back in 1890, making it illegal to create a monopoly or a cartel being a group of colluding firms. We think maybe like within an oligopoly, a small number of firms that are working together, that's illegal. We think about the robber barons of the 1800s, right? Like the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and things like that. But it wasn't really that effective. And so we see 24 years later, they passed the Clayton Antitrust Act, which defined what an attempt to monopolize actually was. And they also created the FTC to prevent monopolies from being created. We also, we saw this FTC that was created. It was meant to protect consumers to prevent price fixing. Price fixing is when companies work together to maybe set their prices artificially high so that they agree to set their prices really high and to make more money and take advantage of consumers. And that's what collusion is. Collusion is that working together. And also to monitor mergers. So if companies want to merge together or if they want to acquire another company, it has to be approved by the government to make sure it's not getting too big so that they're able to regulate it. And so the government also then sets further regulations in order to prevent monopolies from occurring. But then also for natural monopolies that do exist, they set regulations to make sure that they don't get too much power.